Well, it is indeed an absolute pleasure to be back in northern Louisiana. So yay, right? My parents, like he said, went to Louisiana Tech when I was a very little girl. So I lived in Ruston, Louisiana, actually as an infant. And I went to high school at St. Frederick's Catholic School. I know, right? In Monroe, Louisiana. That's where I actually went to high school before I went off to SMU. So since that time, I have definitely bounced around the United States. I have lived in Texas, I have lived in New York, I have lived in Virginia, and I now live on the shores of Lake Michigan. I live in a place called South Haven, Michigan, which that weather y'all had just a couple of days ago, that's spring at my house, just so you know, right? Right, so that's the kind of winters I endure now, and I spend most of my time traveling around doing exactly this. So I get to go to beautiful places. I came from Jacksonville, Florida. Just the other day, I'm gonna go to Miami next week. I'll be in Atlanta the week after that. So I'm on the road all the time. But a couple of months ago, I was at home for about a week, which is a long time for me now. And so I scheduled a dentist appointment. And I had the pleasure of having a brand new dental hygienist. And you know how great that is when you have a new dental hygienist and should know anything about you, doesn't know anything whatsoever. So my new dental hygienist looks down at me and she says, so, what do you do? And I said, I'm an economist. And she goes, a what? And I said, I'm an economist. She takes everything out and she goes, a what? I said, I am an economist. And she looks down and she says, well, what's that? And I said, well, I spend my time talking about the economy, unemployment, inflation, the stock market. And she goes, oh, you're a financial planner. And I said, no, I am not a financial planner, because I knew where that was going. I said, but I do think a lot about interest rates and the Federal Reserve and the banking system. And she goes, well, let me just tell you something. This banking thing is going to crash the entire economy. Whole economy is about to come crashing down. And I thought, 30 seconds ago, you didn't know what an economist was. And now you're telling me that the whole economy is going to come crashing down. But that is the world that I live in now. And it reflects a certain pessimism that seems to have become absolutely permanent. Everyone feels as if the economy is continually on the verge of, if not a recession, then an outright depression. And I see it over and over again. There's a large amount of people out there who believe the economy is permanently in recession. So the first thing I want to do for you guys is sort of clear that up just a little bit. You see, a recession implies economic decline. You actually have to have GDP going down. It's not even that it's just going sideways. You actually have to have output, gross domestic product, consumer spending, retail sales. All of those things actually have to go down for there to be a true recession. Now, if you look over the last year, output, as we measure it by GDP, basically the sum total of what the United States of America produces. Back when the Federal Reserve began raising rates in March of 2022, when interest rates were at zero, remember? And the Federal Reserve began to raise rates by, quarter point here, quarter point there. GDP in America was $25 trillion. So every year, the U.S. economy produced $25 trillion worth of stuff. Cars, medical procedures, defense spending, all that stuff. Today, GDP is $27 trillion. So a $2 trillion increase in GDP. So that's not a recession. Now, what about the unemployment rate, right? Well, back when the Federal Reserve started raising rates, the unemployment rate was about 3.6%. Does anyone know what the unemployment rate is today? I'll just give you a guess, 3.6%. It basically has not changed. Now, inflation, the thing that we all really hate, myself included, back when the Federal Reserve started raising rates, inflation was over 8%. So what that meant was that prices overall, in general, for everything, we're pretty much rising at about 8% a year. That's a higher rate of inflation than we've seen since the 1980s. So definitely, seriously, something to be concerned about. So the Federal Reserve does what it typically does to fight inflation, and it began to raise rates. So interest rates went from 0% to basically where they stand today, which is about 5.5%. And inflation has come down. So that now inflation has gone from a high of over 8% to about 3.5%. If you look at some measures of inflation, there are other measures of inflation that suggest it's below 3%. Now, the Federal Reserve's target is 2%. So we're really close to 2%. Now, this is what economists, their cliche that they use is a soft landing. Has anybody heard this soft landing, right? That's a word that you're hearing about all the time, right? Now, I spend a lot of time on planes. So I don't like to talk about hard landings or soft landings. Like, I just don't even want to talk about it, especially after the last month. Don't want to talk about it at all. But it's the cliche that everyone sort of goes with. This idea that the economy somehow has managed to endure higher interest rates, and yet instead of economic activity going down, which is what most people expected to happen a year ago, it's actually gone up. So this is a fundamental puzzle that I want to talk about today. Because before I can get into sort of what's going on in the economy long term, which I think is in some ways a little bit more interesting, we're going to talk about the long-term trends in the US and how your region can kind of tap into them, right? Those long-term trends, of course, being things like remote work, things like expensive housing markets, things like artificial intelligence. Those are the important long-term trends that really matter for regional economic development. But I do think before we can get to that point, I want us to kind of get all on the same page about where the economy truly is right now and why. Because it is a little bit puzzling. I, like a lot of economists, thought, well, if the Federal Reserve and interest rates go up this much, it's got to have some effect on the economy. And if anyone's involved in residential real estate, you know that it has had an effect there. That certainly people want mortgages at 3%, not 8%. Just anybody in general would prefer a mortgage at 3%, not 8%. So in some sense, residential real estate as a sector, it's not a hard landing or a soft landing, it's in its own airplane. It's not in the same airplane as the rest of the economy. It literally has contracted severely. You've seen basically activity really decline across the board in the United States in that one particular sector. Now, one of the reasons that it's declined so much is that people are waiting for interest rates to go down. That's really what's happening, because everybody rushed to buy a house when interest rates were low, except, of course, my kids, who were, I don't know what they're waiting on, but that's another story, right? They weren't listening to me. So everybody rushes to buy a house when interest rates are low in 2020 and 2021. Really smart. I'm guessing anybody here who had a mortgage probably refied that mortgage at this point. So no one wants to let go of that mortgage. And because everybody understands that interest rates are just temporarily high, no one wants to actually move right now and lock in a really high mortgage rate when everybody kind of understands, even if they sort of, at least in their guts, they understand that the year 2023 is going to be a year when the Federal Reserve actually cuts interest rates. And markets are expecting that to happen probably in March, which is right around the corner, because inflation has come down, economy's growing, and the proper interest rate in this environment for the Federal Reserve is probably about 3.5%, 4%. So that's quite a bit of interest rate cutting next year. So everybody's in this sort of holding pattern. But if you look at the economy broadly, it's been doing remarkably well. Now, this stands in stark contrast to the only other time that the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates so aggressively. It's only happened one other time before, and that was in the early 1980s. The early 1980s. Now, I see a few folks in this room who are the same vintage that I am, right? And so you might remember what happened in the 1970s and in the 1980s. That was the last time that we saw inflation, rising prices, sort of prices for things increase the way that they did in 2020, 2021, and into 2022. It's the only other time it's actually happened. So we don't have a whole lot of examples, but we have one. And because of that one, people sort of expected the economy to behave in the same way. And so one of the things we need to understand is that the economy really is fundamentally different than it was in 1980. So let's just do a quick history lesson around the inflation of the 1970s and the interest rate increases of the 1980s. So back in the 1970s, the US economy was hit with not one, but two energy price shocks. Two oil embargoes that meant gas prices went up really, really quickly. Not like they have recently. I'm talking really high gas prices, right? So the sort of equivalent of if gas had gone up to $5 a gallon, sort of inflation adjusted. So, and really fast. And this was the first time it had ever happened. It happened in 1972, and it happened again in 1978. So you had two bouts of really fast inflation. And so price increases became ingrained in the US economy. And by 1979, inflation was consistently every single year 7, 8, 9%. Every year. It had become a permanent fixture in the US economy. So, a man named Paul Volcker was appointed as the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time. So he was the Jerome Powell of his day, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And he was given the job of bringing inflation under control. And he took that job very, very seriously. And he raised rates, not to 5%, not to 10%, not to 15%. At one point, the Fed funds target rate hit almost 19%. Now, it came down to 15%, but it stayed there for an entire year. So does anybody in the room remember having a mortgage rate that was over 10%? Yeah, some guy, her hand was up so fast, like she didn't even hesitate. She was like, yep, that was me. Mm-hmm. Yep. So when my millennial children cry about mortgage rates at 7%, I'm like, you need to shut up, okay? Because first of all, I told you to buy a house 2 years ago and you didn't do it, okay? And a 7% mortgage rate is not gonna kill you or the housing market because this economy has seen much, much worse and survived. But it was very, very difficult, and it came with an intense human cost. So the economy paid a price, a real price for that inflation in the form of not one recession, but two, in the form of unemployment at 8, 9, 10%. So really high rates of unemployment, and it lasted for a long time. This is a real human cost. And so this is a true hard landing, and it was what everyone was expecting, and it didn't materialize. It didn't happen in the same way. Now, in some ways, I can kind of look back and go, well, of course it wasn't going to happen in the same way because the economy in 1980 is very different in the economy today. But I want to sort of focus in on just what is exactly different because it's going to give us some insight into what's going to happen and how things are going to roll out over the next 5 to 10 years because of these fundamental changes. So what's different today? Well, the first thing that's really different is the role that oil prices and energy play in the economy. You see, back in the 1970s, when those oil price shocks hit, the US was a net importer of oil. We were a net importer of oil. So what that meant was that anytime oil prices went up, we all suffered. Consumers suffered because they paid more to heat their homes and drive their cars. Businesses suffered because they used a lot of oil back then because, see, there was no technology industry. It pretty much was all manufacturing, which uses a lot of energy, particularly back then, to produce GDP. So businesses suffered, people suffered, everybody suffered when oil prices went up because basically, the US was a net importer of oil, so we had to get it from somewhere else. And when the price went up, it was all cost and no benefit. Well, fracking, shale oil revolution has changed the energy scenario very, very quickly. And so now the US is a net exporter of oil. We produce as much as Saudi Arabia, and we are all driving more energy efficient cars. Now, people hate higher gas prices. This is something I've learned over the last 5, 6 years. Even people who drive electric cars are still very sensitive to the price of gasoline, right? It's remarkable. Like, it's just in our sort of economic DNA to be very sensitive to the price of gas. But you and I all know that the economy, we can see it with our own eyes, is transitioning away from basically fuels, fossil fuels, and into other types of energy to power our economy. So it leaves us much less sort of sensitive to the price of oil and gas as consumers. And there are parts of the US, Louisiana being one of those states, that are actually producers of oil. And so when the price of oil goes up, states like Louisiana, Texas, North and South Dakota, Oklahoma, they actually benefit from higher oil prices. So these two things together basically mean that if you net all that out, it used to be that higher oil prices were recessionary in the US. I would argue now, doesn't matter if the price of oil is high, some people win, some people lose. Price of oil goes down, some people win, some people lose. But the net effect seems to be zero. So basically what I'm saying is oil has been neutralized as an economic force of recession or expansion in the United States. So oil's different. Next thing that's different is the role that expectations play. Now, that may seem like something kind of small, but it's extremely important in this example because inflation and prices are one of those weird economic variables where you think they're going is where they actually go. So let me just give you a little bit of an example. I think there are some ladies in this room that like shoes, maybe as much as I do, just looking around. And not all of my audiences are as diverse as this. Usually I talk about golf clubs in most of my audiences, but today I can talk about shoes. Now, everybody gets this, right? Now, we all like nice shoes. And let's suppose that I tell you the price of your favorite shoes is going up in the next 3 months. Regardless of what that might be, every girl's got her favorite, except those Birkenstocks. My God, they're so ugly. Okay, nothing you can do to help those, right? So basically, price of your favorite shoes is going up. What are you all gonna go out and do today? Buy a lot of shoes, exactly. And in doing so, what's gonna happen to the price of your favorite shoes? It's gonna go up. So do you see that your behavior, if you anticipate a price increase, will actually bring it about? And this is true for economies everywhere. And the truth is, this is kind of what we saw happen in 2020, 2021, where everybody said, oh my God, the price of boats is going up. The price of RVs is going up. The price of jet skis is going up. Let's get out there as fast as possible and get our hands on one. And because we all went out to buy RVs, boats, and new appliances at exactly the same time, what happened to the price of all that stuff? It all went up and everybody went, oh my God, look at all that inflation. I'm like, it's your fault. What are you doing replacing appliances that are not broken? So, one of the things about the inflation of the 1970s is that everyone had come to expect it. Everyone said, this is the world we're living in, inflation 7, 8, 9% every single year. And because they expected it, they behaved accordingly and brought that inflation about. What was interesting about the inflation of 2020, 2021, and 2022 is that people's expectations of long-term inflation didn't really change. They stayed between 2 and 3%. Now everybody went, oh my God, inflation, it's so awful, it's so terrible. And for people who suffered with higher energy prices, who struggle to heat their homes, who struggle to feed their families, yeah, inflation is really bad for those people. However, for most folks, basically they looked and went, this is temporary. They may not have understood why exactly, but no one changed their long-run expectations of inflation, which makes it a whole lot easier for the Federal Reserve to do its job. That basically the Federal Reserve has stayed fairly credible throughout this entire experience, and that's meant that it's been a lot easier for them to do what they needed to do compared to the 1970s when Volcker had to raise rates to 19% to get everyone's attention. But then there's the last thing. And this transitions us to these more long-run issues that I want to talk about today. And that last thing is how different the labor force is today than it was in the 1970s. You see, one of the things about the 1970s is it was during that time that all of those baby boomers that were born after the Second World War, my parents basically, poured into the labor markets. So my mom was born in 1949. She went to college and graduated in 1971, right? And so she was right there at the beginning of the 1970s with all those other baby boomers, millions of them all joining the labor force at exactly the same time. The other thing that was happening was that for the first time in American history, women were also joining the labor force at exactly the same time. So for the US in general, the US was awash in excess labor. There were people everywhere all trying to find a job at exactly the same time. And they were at the point in their lives when their skill levels were at the lowest, right? So we typically, as a person, build skill over time. And so their unemployment rates were very, very high. In any country worldwide that has a very young workforce, they typically also have a very high unemployment rate because young people have higher unemployment rates than older people do because they have not yet sort of found their sort of perfect match in the labor market. So the US was characterized by very high rates of unemployment in the 1970s. So inflation was high and unemployment rates were high. There was something, you added the two together, and people called it stagflation, the misery index. Maybe some of you sort of remember the misery index. How'd you like to live in an economy where there's a misery index, right? I mean, that's how bad it was. That was the statistic on the nightly news every single night, because you added unemployment together with inflation, and it was typically somewhere close to 20%. And part of it was because all those baby boomers were pouring into the labor market at the same time. There was lots of excess labor. Unemployment rates were really, really high. So where are we demographically today? Well, what are those baby boomers doing now? They're retiring. And during the pandemic, they all decided to escalate their retirements. I guess they just couldn't figure out how to work the mute button on Zoom. And so they're just like, you know what, I give up. I'm going to retire. I'm going to move to Florida. That's all I ever wanted to do anyway, right? So basically, we did see about 1.6 million excess retirements in 2020 and 2021. That was above and beyond what you would expect. So certainly the pandemic economy escalated retirements. People go, you know what, I don't want to do this remote work thing. Forget about it. I'm just going to retire early. So we did see quite a bit of that. So we've got this excess retirement. We've got people leaving the labor force on that end. And then we have all of those millennials, right, who actually were a demographic group about the same size as the baby boomers. So my parents are baby boomers, right? And my kids are millennials, right? So they all went to college in the mid sort of 2008, 2009. Then they all graduated from college into the Great Recession. Couldn't find jobs, unemployment rates really bad. They all moved back in with their parents. That was kind of the story of 10 years ago. But all of those millennials have now moved into basically their 30s. Right? So they've all moved into their 30s. They've made their perfect match with an employer. They've moved out of their parents' garages. They have found their life partner on Tinder. And now they're doing all those things that we said they would never do, right? They're making long-term commitments. They're starting families. They want houses with yards. They said they never wanted a yard. Suddenly they want a yard. And there's millions of them all wanting to do this at exactly the same time. Now, this is going to be relevant here in just a few minutes. The unemployment rate, though, is 3.6% because all of those millennials who are moving through the labor force are now sort of matched up. Their unemployment rates have come down. And what about the generation behind them? Those Gen Zs. Yeah. The ones who, when I sort of go visit my family at Thanksgiving, I have the same aunt every year, and she goes, you know, young people, they just don't want to work. Young people don't work anymore. They don't. Now, her grandkids work, of course, but not the rest of the young people. They just don't want to work. Can't find anybody to do work. Can't find anybody to work at the Walmart. Can't find anybody to work at the schools. Can't find anybody to work at the game commission. Can't find anybody to work anywhere. Where are the young people? They just don't want to work. And I have to say, you know, it's not that they don't want to work. It's that they don't exist. They were never born. The demographic group that follows the millennials is tens of millions smaller. They basically are a much smaller demographic. So if you're struggling and thinking, where are all the young people? They just don't want to come to Shreveport. I'm like, it's not they don't want to come to Shreveport. They don't want to go everywhere because they aren't there. There aren't that many of them, right? Everybody's struggling to find the same 5, Gen Zers. There's only 5 of them. And everybody goes, well, they just don't want to, they want to remote work. They don't want to come to the office. They just think that they're so entitled. I'm like, it's not that they're entitled. Again, there's only 5 of them. They're going to set the terms. They're going to tell you what they want because there's not that many of them. It's a demographic reality that every community is dealing with. If you think it's just you, it's not. It's everywhere. But there are some long-term trends that I want to talk about today that I think are going to make the next decade around many of these issues very, very different than the last 10 years. For the reasons, in some ways, that I've sort of already pointed to, but I want to kind of connect all of these dots now with sort of some long-term trends. And they have to do specifically with remote work, housing, and artificial intelligence. So we're going to sort of bring those all together for sort of what can you do? How can you sort of plug into these trends as a community? Well, I would argue that for many communities that have seen population decline, for many communities that have been asking themselves, why are we losing residents to New York, Dallas, Atlanta, Washington, D.C.? I mean, who actually really wants to live in New York? Why are they going there? Well, the reason they've been going there for decades is for a job. That the thing that motivated people to move to bigger and bigger cities over, quite frankly, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, friends, this is not new. This has been going on since 1860. That people have been moving into ever more dense communities in search of work, because work used to require you to actually be in the same place that your employer was located. I mean, that was the reality of my life. I'm guessing that's been the reality of all of your lives, that work and your employer basically all kind of went into the same geography. Now, the technological technology as an industry actually escalated this trend because it created sort of superstar tech hubs that functioned mainly because of something economists call spillovers. There was a benefit from being in the same place physically with other people who were thinking about the same things that you were. We see it at universities all the time. The reason people want to hang out with their smart friend colleagues is that they get great ideas from them. That's a spillover effect. Well, if you look at communities like San Francisco, Austin, Texas, those are communities that really took advantage of this spillover effect to build technology hubs. So they attracted all these technology workers because of these spillovers, and it really was location specific. You needed to all be in the same place. And then 2020 comes along, and the great remote work experiment was on. Now, better or worse, here is where we stand today, where we suddenly have realized that about 30% of the hours worked out there in the economy overall can be done from home. And people like it. They don't want to be home all the time. It's not that they don't want to come to the office periodically, but we know from studies done before 2020 that workers on average value flexibility in their work schedule to the tune of about $8,000 a year. See, economists love to put numbers on stuff, right? I like to put numbers on things, right? I want to know how valuable, because you might say I want to work from home, but then the question is, well, how much will you give up to be able to do that? And your average worker will give up $8,000 a year to be able to have flexibility in their work schedules. This is remarkable, right? Because it suggests that employers don't have to pay people as much as they did before, and they can work from home. Now you might say, well, they're less productive at home. Are they $8,000 less productive from home is my question to you. Because you see, it implies that there's some place to meet in the middle. And if you're in the camp that says this remote work thing isn't gonna last, I am here to tell you, yes, It will. This is the world we are living in now. Employers can cut their commercial footprint, right? So they don't need as much office space, so they're not paying as much. And even if their workers are a little bit less productive around the edges, it's not going to be enough to sort of counteract that, particularly in a world where talent is scarce. So what does that mean for communities that we're losing people who might have wanted to stay where their family roots are, but couldn't because they needed to go someplace else to find the job of their dream, so to speak? So for communities like this, particularly I would say, these medium-sized communities, right? Because I would call you a medium-sized community, right? You're not a small town, right? You're a big enough town that you can have enough people to have the cultural amenities that people want. They want restaurants. They want bike paths. Do you guys know that you have the best massage therapist in America here at this hotel? I was with her today. The reason I feel so good right now is a woman named Sonia rubbed on me in a way that I am never going to forget. Shout out to Sonia. You should all book an appointment with this woman. She is amazing. These are the things that make life worth living in sort of the new world of remote work. Every community has them. Every community has, that family pull. If it's big enough, it's going to have interesting cuisine. I didn't realize there was something called Asian Cajun, but I am really excited to try it. Seriously, and I'm really not joking here. If you put me in charge of marketing Shreveport, I would blast that in every food magazine in America. You guys have like 8 ramen shops. It's the weirdest thing. I'm like, I want this ramen, but why not? These are the things that can make a difference to a community on a margin, and the work equation that used to really sort of limit the possibilities, that's gone now. And then there's this other thing that you have that is in great sort of desirability need nationwide, and that is affordable housing. Let me tell you something. In the United States of America, the average home now selling for $480,000, the median. The median, $480,000 is the median home sale price. I looked up what it is in Shreveport. It's $180,000. That's the other thing I would put on a billboard every 20 miles between here and Dallas. Do you know what you can buy a house for in Shreveport? Do you know what you can buy a house for in Shreveport? And this is the thing, this is why I spent so much time talking about those millennials. They spent the last decade basically living in apartments, saying they never wanted a yard, they were never gonna have kids, they were never gonna get married, and guess what? They're all doing that now. And they wanna do it close to their families. And they want to have the big yard, the big house. They want all of those things, and it is the bottleneck for many of them. And communities that have affordable housing, I am watching it before my eyes. I am seeing them transition to something different because they have something that people want and they can't get it anywhere else. And the best example I have right now of that is Detroit. Now I live in the state of Michigan, and ever since I've lived there, Detroit has been sort of the prime example of the urban basket case. The place you don't want to live, bad everything, right? I mean, you just say Detroit and people go, oh yeah, Detroit, right? I was in Detroit about 4 months ago. Do you know that they just opened a Gucci store downtown in Detroit? Brand new, giant Gucci. I thought I was hallucinating. I thought I might be like in a dream because I'd never seen a Gucci store that big. I was like, honey, that looks like a Gucci store in the middle of downtown Detroit. That is proof that things are changing and that the abundance of accessible housing, because affordable housing, I shouldn't say affordable because that kind of means something different. I'm going to call it accessible housing. Accessible housing can turn communities around, and that is the story of what is going on in Detroit right now. People can't afford to buy in the community I live in. I live in a tiny little community where it feels as if every baby boomer in America has decided to retire right next door to me. right? So you can't afford to live in my community any longer. I bought a house there 10 years ago, and the price of it has doubled, if not tripled, in this new environment. So there's no place for young people to go. We don't have any affordable housing at all. So it's over with. So what are they doing? Well, they're just moving back to Detroit, basically. So that sort of thing is really mattering right now. It matters a lot. But then you can say, well, but you know what? What about our schools? And what about our workforce development? Because those are really sort of the last piece of all this. And it comes down to the ways that artificial intelligence is about to transform the economy that we're living in. Now, I gotta tell you, I can't tell you how large language models and artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, all that stuff, I can't tell you how it works. But here's the thing, the people who developed it, they don't know how it works either. So it's really not that big of a deal, right? We don't all have to know how it works, right? Do you know how your cell phone works? I don't, but I know what it does, right? I know what it does. I don't need to know how it works. I mean, there could be all kinds of little ants in there or something for all I know. I have no idea how the thing works, but I know what it does. And here's what I know about artificial intelligence. The simplest way to understand it is this. It is an innovation in a long line of innovations that have been labor augmenting and labor saving, that have improved our standards of living over the last 200 years, that have taken us from a society where most of us would scratch our living out of the dirt, die young, lose half of our children before the age of 5 years old, and not ever be particularly healthy or maybe happy in doing it. I mean, that was the world prior to the Industrial Revolution. Pretty dark and mean, as far as I'm concerned. Not a place for me who likes to get a massage once a week, for sure. Like, I wouldn't have lasted 10 days. Now, we get the steam engine, we get electricity, we get the internet. All of these things have been in a sort of slow progress of improving people's standards of living. Because see, here's what improves standards of living. Working less and having more. That's what I want for everybody, not just in America. I want that for the entire world. I want us all to have more and work less for it. That's what every economist wants. That's our golden, that's what we're going for. How do we work less and have more, right? If we so choose to. Right? If you don't want to have more, fine, that'll be your choice. But if you want more, you ought to have the opportunity to do that. That's the world that sort of, as an economist, sort of is my, like, here's what the whole goal of all of this is. I look at artificial intelligence, and it essentially lowers the cost of cognition. That's the way you need to understand it. Just like the steam engine lowered the cost of horsepower, right? So the steam engine meant that you could do things and not use horses to do it. Tractors lowered the cost of power. All of these things now, we're coming on this world where we are lowering the cost of cognition. Now, there's a lot of scary things about that. There's a lot of people who are saying, well, this is a technology that could destroy the world. I don't understand that exactly, but I'm going to believe them when they say it, which means, and I'm not a big sort of fan of government regulation. You'll sort of get that about me. But when I look at something like, say, nuclear weapons, I'm kind of okay with the government regulating that a little bit. I just am. Like, I can sort of put aside my libertarian leanings and say, there are some technologies that are just so dangerous that, like, I don't want my brother to have access to them, okay? And I think artificial intelligence, and particularly large language models, may fall into this category, right? So, and the people who are developing them are kind of on the same page. They're like, please regulate us. Please regulate us. So, we're in this world where we probably need to put some boundaries around this technology. But at the same time, it holds the potential to do two really interesting things. Number one, improve education. It holds the potential to basically deliver to each and every child their own personal tutor, and to supplement teachers who are struggling in the classroom day in and day out to just deliver basic bottom line education. What happens when you can make the cost of cognition so much lower and tailor those programs to whatever individual need that child has. That changes education, right? So you can vastly improve education, not just for the wealthiest, but for everybody. So that's one incredible potential of all this, the ability for it to improve education, which in some ways, for a lot of communities, is a real stumbling block. How do you market yourself if you can't say, everybody wants to say we have the best public schools in America. Well, what I want is for all public schools in America to all be equally great. That's really what I want. And this is a technology that could go a long way towards lifting everybody at least a little bit. Now, that gets me to the second part, which is that some of the evidence that economists are sort of coming across, there was a recent study done on 750 Boston Consulting Group employees, and they gave them access to an artificial intelligence tool. And then they tracked their work. And what they found was that those employees that used it, there was a 40% improvement in the quality of their work, and they did it 20% faster. Pretty amazing. But what was more interesting about that study, when I sort of read the whole thing, was that the biggest improvements came not in the best performers, but in the worst. That the biggest improvements came not from the superstars who really didn't need it, it came from that sort of bottom tier of employees. Now, okay, the bottom tier of employees, by the way, at the Boston Consulting Group are gonna all be pretty good already, just so we sort of get that out of the way. But the point is, we have some evidence that the biggest gains come to the lowest skilled employees, which when I started to get my mind around that and I realized that if you've got a workforce that struggles with skill levels, what happens when you give them tools that bring big benefits to them, to their abilities, right? That you don't need to have sort of perfect English any longer to produce reports that have perfect English. I mean, get your brains around that. We're all worried about it replacing workers, okay? I don't worry about it replacing too many workers unless you're a lawyer, okay? You're a lawyer, an accountant, probably a computer programmer. There's going to be some consolidation in those industries. You're not gonna need as many people looking at documents when you have a tool that can summarize large amounts of text and produce analysis based on it. But what does that mean in healthcare? Well, what it means is now you can take huge amounts of data and do diagnostics. It doesn't mean you don't need a doctor at all, but a doctor now has a tool that makes them much more accurate and much more efficient and takes some of the thing away from them that they hate, which is the paperwork. I mean, does anybody like to do paperwork? I mean, if you do, raise your hand. I'm sure somebody will give you a job in this room, right? No one likes to do paperwork. And this is what artificial intelligence, this is its thing. That's what it does. So I look and go, I think it's a technology that really has the potential to remap economic activity across the United States, particularly in areas that struggle with workforce development and skill levels of the average worker in their area. Artificial intelligence suddenly lifts that group and has the potential to lift that group. And I think that's one of the biggest developments over the next 10 years. It's not that we need to regulate it. There are things about it that you need to be afraid of. But in general, its potential to deliver, what I said before, more stuff with less work. That's where I see it going over the next 10 years. So, I have talked about a lot of stuff today, but in general, what I find is, particularly with groups like this, the questions that people ask are actually more interesting sometimes than what I have to say. And so, I would love to sort of take some questions from the audience if you guys are up for that. I always like to do Q&A. And this is a small enough group that I can hear you. And so I'll repeat the question back if you want to just ask it. I mean, don't all ask it once, but like raise your hand and I'll call on you. I feel like a school teacher again, right? But I'm willing to entertain questions.
Marci, we have 2 mic holders.
Oh, you have 2 mic holders.
Yeah, we have
okay.
Maxie
all right.
and we
so
have
they're
Terry.
telling me it's like, don't take over the show, girl. We got mic holders. Okay.
We went all out for you, Marci.
You sure did.
We went all out.
All right. So, yep.
Does someone have a question?
Oh, we got all the way in the back.
And the amount of hardship 401ks when it comes to the economic spending and consumer spending.
Sure. So what's the path of consumer spending look like when credit card debt is at an all-time high? Absolutely true. By the way, there's a few other things at absolute high. Student loan debt, also really, really high. Mortgage debt, also very, very high. I'm always careful with those statistics for a couple of reasons. Number one, they are nominal statistics, meaning that they grow with the economy, right? So it doesn't surprise me that the value of debt goes up because, like I said before, the economy grew from 25 trillion to 27 trillion. So the amount of debt in an economy like that is going to be a lot bigger because everything is growing. So that sort of is one caveat. You always want to compare debt to GDP to sort of get a better sense of it. So one of the things we also know that's kind of counterintuitive is that debt tends to go down during recessions. Debt goes down during recessions because the reason people, believe it or not, and this is something that it's just so hard to disabuse people of this idea. Most of us think people take on debt because they're just irresponsible or they can't control themselves and all that kind of stuff. But the truth is people take on debt because they believe the future will be better than today. That's why people take on debt. Now that probably isn't why you took on debt. You took on debt to buy a new handbag. That's why you took on debt, right? But you did that because you believe there's going to be a party next week and I want to look good for it. The whole point, though, in all seriousness, is this. Debt levels tend to be counter-cyclical. They don't move the economy. I have been hearing people talk for at least 15 years about how student loan debt is going to collapse the economy. And I have yet to see it happen. It's just not the way things work. People take on debt because they think they'll be able to pay it off later. It actually speaks to their optimism. It's funny, no matter how pessimistic everybody actually says they are about the economy, they act in the complete opposite direction. If you really thought everything was going to heck in a handbasket, you'd be saving 25% of your income. You would. Because see, we know that people's savings rates go up whenever there's a recession. Happens over and over again. I could show you the data. I could have brought that chart, but I want you looking at me. Not gonna lie, just who I am. So I've never, even though these numbers come up, and yes, for individuals, debt can be very, very burdensome. But when I look at it in the context of the entire economy, debt tends to be a byproduct of other things. It doesn't actually drive economic activity. Which is sort of, it's one of those things that comes up over and over and over again. And it's always been very interesting to me that I would have thought savings goes, down during a recession. And come to find out, savings goes up during a recession because people start to worry about the future. Yep, anybody else? Okay.
Around the country, are
Sure.
we going to have another mortgage crisis?
Sure. So what happens to commercial real estate when all of those office building mortgages come up and nobody wants to go to offices anymore? Well, the funny thing about commercial real estate is that it always becomes obsolete. So that's really what's happened, is that suddenly office space that people thought would be obsolete in 20 years is now obsolete today. So that's a kind of a little bit different way of thinking about it, right? Is that the office space that we thought we would need in 5 years, we don't actually need today. So basically what it means is that there will be some pain. And so anybody who sort of owns those office buildings, right, or holds the debt on those office buildings, they're going to take losses. The difference is when there's a residential real estate crisis, we all own homes, right? Or at least 60-something% of Americans own a home, so everybody feels it. How many people actually own a commercial building that gets leased out for office space? I mean, a couple folks, yeah, I'm sorry. Right? But in general, it's not a wildly held asset class. Now, believe it or not, some of you might own it in your investment accounts and don't realize it, right? You may own a commercial REIT or something like that. So you will be impacted, but one of the things is those leases are staggered, right? And so they don't all come due at exactly the same time. The banking sector has sort of insulated themselves much better from commercial real estate than in the 1980s, the last time we saw a residential or a commercial real estate crisis. The other thing, too, that I'm really hoping for is that some of that obsolete office space gets transformed into housing, particularly in communities that desperately need housing. And so one of the things that I've sort of been watching that I think is so fascinating are the way that architects are repurposing some of these buildings so that people can live in them. It's really exciting. Like, I just groove on that kind of stuff, that basically you can take a building, a shopping center, something, and how do you repurpose it for the thing that communities desperately need, which are houses, right? And so it's going to be hard for a concentrated group of people, but I don't expect it to have the reverberations that it would have had in the 80s, because the banking sector is more insulated against it. They don't own it, and it's going to happen in a staggered fashion. But great question. Anybody else?
In the back, Maxie?
In the back.
Hi, I was wondering how likely you think it is that China will overtake the U.S. as the world's largest economy within the next decade.
Not going to happen. Next question. No, I'll be a little bit more serious. It isn't going to happen, right? And here's the deal. China has 3 problems. China has a demographic fall off that will be crippling for them. And so normally population adjustments happen in an economy very, very slowly, and we have time to sort of deal with them. Because of their one-child policy, their population has peaked. They have reached their peak population, and it is about to fall off a cliff. Now, for those of you who sort of think that smaller populations are better, let me sort of give you a reason to sort of not think that. No mayor of any town in America ever comes up and says, "People of Shreveport, I have a great news for you. Our population has declined for the 20th year in a row." Right? Nobody thinks that's a good idea at a local level, right? We all understand at a local level, we actually want more people to come, right? So I don't know why at a national level we got to keep folks out. We need a smaller population in America. I'm like, if it's not true for your city, then why would it possibly be true for a nation? So China sort of, in order, I don't know why they did it. I'm not going to get into what they were thinking, but somebody got the harebrained idea to limit family size, not understanding that when you do that, 50 years out, you suddenly have a society where you've got lots of old people that are being supported by one child. And anybody in here who cares for aging parents knows what I am talking about. But at least those of you who care for your aging parents, I hope you have a sibling like mine who does most of the emotional work so I don't have to. But that's a country where you've got one person caring for 2 parents, and frequently 2 sets of grandparents as well. This is not a recipe for growth. This is a recipe for stagnation. So they've got a population problem. They have a residential real estate crisis on their hands that makes the U.S. Great Recession look like a tea party. And I'm talking about a fun tea party, not a not fun tea party. I'm talking about they overbuilt so badly. They have lots of empty space, nobody to put it into, and here's how they do it. They sell you the house and you pay for it before it's even built. So a lot of people have sunk their life savings into a house that's never going to be built. So they're ruined financially. And they don't live in the kind of economy where they can say, you know what, I was ruined financially by these policies, you are voted out. So that's the second thing. And then they're facing deflation because of that process. Because house prices are falling, puts deflationary pressure on everything. And as bad as inflation is, deflation is worse. So all that being said, China even if they surpass the US in the sum total size of their economy, right? So we're a 27 trillion economy. Let's suppose that we wake up tomorrow and China is a $30 trillion economy. You say, well, look how China's bigger than the US. How many people live in China? A squillion. That's how many people live there, right? Squillion people. It's actually they have about 3 times the population we do. So if you adjust the numbers, which you always have to do for population, their GDP per person is a third of what it is in America. That means their standard of living is a third of what yours is. So don't talk to me ever about China surpassing the United States in terms of the size of their economy. I mean, you can ask me about it. I didn't mean like that. I wasn't picking on you in particular. But I read these stories. Everybody's sort of, oh, China's going to surpass the US. Does anybody remember when Japan was going to surpass the US? I was in college. Yeah, thank you for laughing. I was in college. You know what everybody said to me in college? You need to learn to speak Japanese because we're all going to be speaking Japanese. I'm so glad I didn't learn Japanese. First of all, can you imagine my Japanese with this hillbilly accent? Nobody would ever understood me, right? I'd be speaking Japanese and they'd just look at me, right? So I never was going to get to learn Japanese anyway. And that turned out to be a fallacy. See, one of the things we tend to do as Americans, I find, is that we're always afraid about some other country being bigger than us, right? We're always worried about it. And the truth is, the rest of the world tends to have more faith in our economy than we do. It's why people will kill to come here. It's why they will risk their lives and die to get to this country, because they actually believe in it many times more than we do. Seriously, they do. They do. And so, it was Japan at one point, it was China at another. So if you're telling your kids they need to learn Mandarin in college, tell them to take basket weaving. Yeah.
Dr. Rossell, thank you so much.
Thank you
We're running
so
out of
much.
time
It was
here.
great
Ladies and
time.
gentlemen,
Thank you,
Dr.
guys.
Marci Rossell.
Appreciate it.